I never imagined my life could unravel in a single moment. The man I loved, the man I trusted with my heart, turned away from me because of lies whispered by the woman who should have welcomed me as family. I had no idea that Catherine, my mother-in-law, would become the architect of my destruction, planting seeds of doubt so skillfully that Matthew would believe them without question. If you've ever felt betrayed by someone you trusted, I want you to hear this story because surviving is possible, even when the people who should love you most turn against you. My name is Isabella, and a few years ago I believed my marriage was unshakable. Matthew was everything I had dreamed of: charming, thoughtful, protective, and I trusted him with every piece of my heart. I thought our love was strong, that our bond was unbreakable, and that no one could interfere with the life we had built together. I was wrong. From the beginning, Catherine had a subtle way of influencing Matthew. She would praise him for making smart choices, for listening to her advice, and for being cautious about the world around him. At first, I dismissed it as harmless concern, a mother looking out for her son. But slowly, her words began to change the way Matthew saw me. Every comment, every insinuation, every casual remark about other women or my supposed flaws started planting doubt in his mind. And I, blinded by love, did not notice the storm forming. It started with small things. Matthew would question my choices, my friendships, my decisions, as if my love for him was something that needed proof every day. I reassured him, explained myself, and offered transparency in every way imaginable. But the seeds Catherine had planted took root. She told him I might be hiding things, that I might not be loyal, that my intentions were not as pure as they seemed. And the cruelest part? He believed her. I remember the day it all became clear. I had been waiting for Matthew to come home from work, carrying dinner for us, hoping for a quiet evening together. He walked in, avoided my eyes, and simply said, "We need to talk." The words were casual, almost normal, but the chill in his voice froze me. I knew instantly something had changed, that the man I loved had been replaced by someone I barely recognized. Catherine's influence had worked perfectly. Within a matter of weeks, Matthew had convinced himself that I was unfaithful, that I had deceived him, and that the only solution was to end our marriage. He demanded a divorce, coldly, without proof, without discussion, without giving me the chance to defend myself. The woman who should have supported me, the one who gave birth to the man I loved, had instead guided him toward betrayal, whispering lies with a smile, while my life crumbled around me. The first months after the divorce were unbearable. I moved into a small apartment that felt more like a cage than a home. Every corner reminded me of what I had lost: my friends, my freedom, and the life I had dreamed of building with Matthew. Nights were the hardest, filled with silence and memories, haunted by the knowledge that Catherine's manipulation had succeeded where love had failed. I cried endlessly, not just for Matthew, but for the years of my life that had been stolen, the dreams that had been shattered, and the trust that had been obliterated. But slowly, survival became my only option. I threw myself into work, finding refuge in the routine and the small victories that reminded me I was still capable, still alive, and still whole. Friends reached out, offering support, though I often pushed them away, too ashamed and too raw to accept comfort. I began to learn the quiet lessons of resilience, of enduring grief without letting it define me, and of building a life even when betrayal had made me feel small and insignificant. Meanwhile, Matthew's life went on. He seemed calm on the surface, as if he had made the right choice, as if Catherine's guidance had protected him from a disaster he had never truly understood. But even as he moved forward, cracks began to appear. The certainty Catherine had given him was brittle. Questions he could not answer began to surface in quiet moments alone. Doubt crept in slowly, though he was too proud to admit it at first. Even Matthew, strong and confident as he appeared, was not immune to the realization that perhaps he had been deceived. It was not my concern, at least. I told myself that, but deep inside, I hoped that one day the truth would find its way back to him. Not for the sake of reconciliation, but for the sake of justice, for the validation of the woman Catherine had tried to destroy, and for the restoration of the life that had been ripped from my hands. I began documenting everything. Memories, incidents, and the subtle ways Catherine had manipulated both of us. I did not know if Matthew would ever see it, but the act itself was empowering. It reminded me that my story still belonged to me, that my truth was intact, and that someday, someone might recognize the reality I had lived out. As the months passed, I learned more about myself than I had in years of marriage. I discovered that strength is not loud or boastful. It is quiet, enduring, and patient. I found joy in small things, like a sunrise over the city, the laughter of a friend, or the pride of completing a project that mattered. I learned that survival does not mean forgetting pain, but living with it in a way that allows you to continue forward, intact and capable of love, trust, and growth. Yet, even as I rebuilt my life, the shadow of Catherine's betrayal loomed. Every time I saw Matthew or heard news of him, I felt the sting of what had been lost, the life that could have been, and the innocence that had been stolen. The pain was a constant companion, reminding me that manipulation can be more devastating than any force of nature, and that even the strongest love can be undermined by deceit if vigilance falters. And still, I survived. I survived because I refused to let Catherine define my life. I survived because I trusted myself when no one else would. I survived because I believed, even in the darkest hours, that truth and justice have a way of finding their path, even if it takes years. And I survived because, despite everything, I was determined to prove that a life destroyed by lies can be rebuilt with dignity, courage, and strength. Little did I know that the years to come would test every ounce of my endurance, reveal secrets I could not have imagined, and force both Matthew and Catherine to confront the consequences of their actions in ways none of us could have foreseen. The days after the divorce were the hardest I had ever endured, but slowly, I began to discover a strength I didn't know I had. Each morning, I woke to the quiet solitude of my apartment and felt the emptiness that Matthew's absence had left. It was not just the absence of a husband, but the absence of the life I had imagined, the home I had dreamed of, the family I had hoped to nurture. Every room, every object, every memory felt like a reminder of the life stolen by Catherine's lies and Matthew's blind trust. Yet, with every tear, every sleepless night, and every moment of despair, I began to realize that survival was no longer a choice but a necessity. I immersed myself in work, losing myself in tasks that required focus and attention, anything to distract from the gnawing ache in my chest. My friends tried to reach me, calling and inviting me out, but I often declined, unable to bear the thought of putting on a brave face when I felt so broken inside. And yet, in my isolation, I discovered a quiet power, the ability to exist, to breathe, and to move forward despite the storm raging around me. I started keeping a journal, not just of my days, but of every thought, every injustice, every subtle manipulation Catherine had orchestrated. Writing became my therapy, a way to reclaim my life from the chaos imposed upon me. Matthew, meanwhile, seemed to settle into his new life with a certainty I could not understand. From the outside, it appeared that he had made the right choice, the one that Catherine had guided him toward, free from doubt and remorse. But over time, I began to notice small cracks in his composed exterior. A hesitation when he spoke my name, a pause when he recounted memories of our marriage, a look in his eyes that seemed to search for something he could not name. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it told me that the seeds of doubt Catherine had planted in me had also begun to root in him. I resisted the temptation to reach out. Part of me wanted to see if Matthew would realize the truth on his own, to allow justice to emerge without my interference. But another part of me, the part that had been hurt most deeply, wanted confirmation that he would finally see Catherine for what she truly was, the manipulative, controlling woman who had orchestrated our separation. Weeks passed and his questions became more pointed, his tone less certain when he spoke about the past. I watched silently, my heart a mixture of cautious hope and lingering pain, knowing that the reckoning I longed for was slowly approaching. During this time, Catherine's influence over Matthew began to falter. The woman who had so confidently guided him toward distrust and betrayal found herself faced with inconsistencies in her own stories, contradictions in her own logic, and the quiet rise of a truth she could no longer suppress. Her overconfidence became her weakness. Every carefully constructed lie had relied on Matthew's unquestioning obedience. And now, as he began to notice discrepancies, her authority began to crumble. I did not rejoice at her unraveling. I had learned that triumph over another's destruction is hollow. My satisfaction came from the realization that justice, in its quiet form, was finally taking shape. It was a slow awakening for Matthew. He began revisiting conversations, reflecting on moments he had dismissed, and examining the subtle ways Catherine had steered his thoughts and decisions. He remembered her remarks about other women, her praise when he doubted me, and the careful insinuations that had convinced him of my unfaithfulness. Each memory, once ignored or rationalized, now came into focus. The realization that he had been manipulated filled him with a mix of guilt, regret, and disbelief. How could he have trusted Catherine over me? How could he have allowed someone else's lies to dismantle the life we had built? For me, watching Matthew's awakening was both painful and validating. I felt the lingering hurt of years lost, of dreams unfulfilled, of love betrayed. But I also felt a quiet sense of vindication, knowing that the truth could not be suppressed indefinitely. Catherine had built her web of control with precision and cunning. But even the most careful manipulation falters in the face of observation, reflection, and undeniable evidence. Matthew's journey toward clarity was slow, but inevitable, and I realized that my resilience had preserved not just my own life, but the possibility of justice as well. During this period, I also focused on rebuilding my personal life beyond the shadow of betrayal. I nurtured friendships I had neglected, pursued interests I had set aside, and discovered a sense of independence that was both empowering and liberating. The pain of the past remained, but it no longer defined me. I had learned to survive, to thrive, and to reclaim control over my own story. The realization that I could endure Catherine's manipulations and Matthew's misplaced trust without losing myself became a cornerstone of my identity. Then came the turning point. A casual remark from a mutual acquaintance, a story shared without intent, revealed a discrepancy in Catherine's account that Matthew could not ignore. The moment was subtle, almost mundane, but it sparked a series of reflections that culminated in a quiet storm of realization. Catherine's careful narrative, once impenetrable, began to unravel under the scrutiny of memory, evidence, and instinct. Matthew started asking questions, probing gently, testing the waters, and seeking confirmation of the truths I had lived and endured in silence. I met him one evening at a cafe, a neutral place that carried no memories of our past life together. The sight of him stirred a complex storm of emotions, the hurt of abandonment, the lingering love once felt, and the cautious hope that the man before me might finally see the truth. He did not come with apologies, demands, or expectations. He came seeking understanding, seeking answers, and seeking a clarity that had eluded him for far too long. I shared my experiences, recounting in detail the subtle manipulations, the relentless doubts planted by Catherine, and the relentless pain of being condemned without proof. His reaction was profound. I could see the weight of years lost pressing down on him, the realization of betrayal, and the dawning understanding that the woman he had cast aside had never been unfaithful, deceitful, or disloyal. The guilt in his eyes was tempered by a quiet resolve to make sense of the past, to confront the lies he had believed, and to seek reconciliation with reality. For me, this was not about rekindling love, but about witnessing the truth finally emerge, about observing justice quietly reclaim what had been stolen. Over the following weeks, Matthew's awakening deepened. He revisited conversations with Catherine, analyzed her statements, and reflected on moments he had dismissed or ignored. He began to document evidence, piece together inconsistencies, and acknowledge the magnitude of manipulation that had orchestrated our separation. Each realization was a step toward clarity, a journey that I had silently endured alone, and now, I watched as he navigated the painful terrain of understanding. Catherine, oblivious to the growing awareness in her son, continued her attempts to control, unaware that the very foundation of her influence was weakening. Every lie she had constructed relied on unquestioned obedience, And with Matthew's critical reflection, her authority began to crumble. I did not intervene directly. I let the truth and Matthew's perception do the work. The satisfaction was quiet but profound, the realization that resilience, integrity, and patience can dismantle even the most calculated deception. As part 2 progressed, I began to recognize a shift not just in Matthew but in myself. I had endured betrayal, isolation, and the shattering of a life I had once believed secure, yet I had not lost my identity. The years of pain had forged strength, clarity, and a deep understanding of my own resilience. I could see now that survival was not merely enduring hardship, but actively reclaiming one's life, asserting one's truth, and allowing justice, even delayed, to take its course. Little did I know that the next part of this journey would bring confrontations, revelations, and the unmasking of Catherine's manipulations in ways that would leave all of us forever changed. The foundation she had built on lies was fragile, and soon, every carefully constructed deception would be exposed, tested, and dismantled. But for now, Isabella survived, Matthew questioned, and the quiet tension of truth beginning to emerge hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The realization that Matthew had begun to question Catherine's words filled me with a mix of hope and caution. Hope, because at last he was beginning to see the truth. Caution, because I knew Catherine would not allow her lies to unravel quietly. She was cunning, precise, and relentless, and her manipulations had caused years of pain. But I had learned over time that even the most carefully constructed deceptions have weaknesses, and Matthew's emerging awareness would expose cracks she could not repair. In the weeks that followed, Matthew's behavior changed in subtle yet unmistakable ways. He would pause during conversations, reflect on memories that had once seemed insignificant, and ask questions that required him to confront his own complicity in my suffering. He began revisiting the past with a critical eye, piecing together incidents that had always felt off, and slowly, the pattern Catherine had carefully woven started to reveal itself. The process was not immediate, nor was it easy, but each step brought clarity. I observed this transformation with a mixture of relief and lingering pain. Relief because the truth I had carried alone for so long was finally recognized. Pain because the years lost could never be returned. The moments stolen could never be replaced, and the innocence shattered by betrayal could never fully heal. Yet, the awareness that justice, even in its quiet form, was approaching gave me strength. I had survived Catherine's manipulation, endured Matthew's blind trust in her, and remained steadfast in my truth. And now the consequences of her actions were coming to light. Matthew began seeking answers, asking questions about moments he had dismissed, conversations he had forgotten, and details he had overlooked. Each inquiry was a step toward reconciliation with reality, a process of dismantling the lies that had shaped his perception. He revisited our interactions, recalling my explanations, my reassurances, and the evidence of my loyalty that had been ignored. The more he reflected, the clearer it became that Catherine's influence had been the driving force behind the destruction of our marriage. During this period, I continued to rebuild my own life. I nurtured friendships I had neglected, pursued passions I had abandoned, and focused on self-discovery. The pain of betrayal remained, but it no longer defined me. I had developed a resilience that allowed me to navigate the world with confidence, integrity, and clarity. Each day was a testament to survival, a demonstration that even in the face of manipulation and heartbreak, it is possible to reclaim one's life and dignity. Matthew's growing awareness culminated in a series of private confrontations with Catherine. He began questioning her narratives, challenging her assertions, and seeking evidence for claims that had once been accepted without hesitation. Catherine, unprepared for this scrutiny, faltered under the weight of his inquiries. Her lies, once unquestioned, could not withstand the persistent probing of a man who was determined to uncover the truth. The subtle power she had wielded over both of us began to erode, and I watched from a distance, understanding that the unraveling of deception is often most effective when observed rather than forced. The first direct confrontation came unexpectedly. Matthew, armed with reflections, recollections, and a growing understanding of the inconsistencies in Catherine's stories, asked questions she could not answer. Her calm facade cracked, her confident tone wavered, and for the first time, the woman who had orchestrated my suffering appeared vulnerable. The sight of her faltering under scrutiny was not satisfying. Rather, it was a reminder that truth, once recognized, has a way of asserting itself, and that manipulation cannot endure against persistent observation and reason. In the midst of this, I began to notice subtle shifts in Matthew's demeanor. He no longer viewed me with suspicion or doubt. Instead, he approached interactions with caution, humility, and a desire to understand. The man who had once abandoned me in blind trust of his mother's words was now navigating the complex terrain of guilt, realization, and the search for truth. I could see the internal struggle, the weight of years lost, and the painful recognition of the consequences of believing lies. As Matthew confronted Catherine, I continued to reclaim my life. I pursued opportunities for growth, engaged in new experiences, and nurtured relationships that had been neglected during the years of turmoil. Each step reinforced my resilience, proving that even when life is upended by deception, it is possible to rebuild with integrity, strength, and purpose. The pain remained, but it no longer defined me. I was no longer a passive victim, but an active participant in shaping the future I deserved. The breaking point for Catherine came gradually but inevitably. Each question, each reflection, each piece of evidence Matthew presented chipped away at her carefully constructed web. Her influence, once absolute, began to crumble under the weight of scrutiny and truth. The confidence that had allowed her to manipulate both her son and me was replaced by defensiveness, frustration, and the realization that her power was no longer sufficient to control the narrative. For the first time in years, she faced the consequences of her actions without the ability to manipulate or distort reality. I observed the unraveling of Catherine's control with a quiet awareness. There was no triumph in witnessing her vulnerability. Rather, there was a profound understanding that resilience, patience, and adherence to truth are forces that ultimately prevail against manipulation. My years of suffering had forged strength, clarity, and the ability to endure without losing oneself, and now the consequences of deception were being revealed without my direct intervention. Matthew's growth during this period was remarkable. He began to acknowledge his own role in allowing Catherine's lies to dictate his actions. Reflecting on moments when doubt had replaced trust and manipulation had overridden love. The process was painful, filled with remorse and regret, but it was necessary for understanding, reconciliation, and the eventual restoration of truth. I could see the man he had become, a man tempered by reflection, accountability, and the recognition of mistakes emerging from the shadows of manipulation. As the confrontation between Matthew and Catherine intensified, the truth that had long been suppressed began to emerge fully. Details that had been ignored, memories that had been dismissed, and inconsistencies that had been rationalized now formed a coherent narrative that could no longer be denied. Catherine's web of lies, meticulously crafted over years, was dismantled. By the combined forces of observation, reflection, and persistent inquiry. Throughout this process, I remained vigilant but patient. I knew that the revelation of truth would not happen instantly, that the consequences of deception take time to manifest, and that those who manipulate others often resist recognition until evidence becomes undeniable. My role was not to intervene, but to endure, to survive, and to allow the natural unfolding of justice to take place. The knowledge that my resilience had preserved not only my dignity, but also the integrity of truth was empowering. By the end of Part 3, the dynamics had shifted significantly. Matthew's awareness of Catherine's manipulation was clear, her control over him diminished, and my position as a survivor of deception was firmly established. The stage was set for the next phase of the story, the full exposure of lies, the confrontation of consequences, and the eventual resolution that would bring justice, closure, and emotional reckoning for all involved. Isabella had endured. Matthew was awakening, and Catherine's carefully constructed world of influence was beginning to collapse. The tension had been building for months, a silent storm that hovered over every interaction, every thought, every memory. I had endured Catherine's manipulation, Matthew's blind trust in her, and the slow erosion of my own life. But now, the air itself seemed to hum with the inevitability of change. Matthew had begun to see the cracks in the foundation Catherine had built, and each revelation brought him closer to the truth he had long resisted. Yet, the process was far from simple. Catherine's cunning, her persistence, and her refusal to admit any wrongdoing made every step forward feel like walking on a razor's edge. I remember the morning Matthew came to my apartment, a look of determination on his face that I had not seen since the early days of our marriage. There was no hesitation, no doubt, only a quiet resolve that spoke of a man who had finally recognized the consequences of deceit. "Isabella," he said softly, "I need to understand everything. I need to know the truth from your perspective, without anyone else's influence." His voice trembled slightly, betraying the weight of regret and the pain of years lost, but the sincerity in his eyes left no room for doubt. I nodded, realizing that this moment was the culmination of months of patience, endurance, and silent observation. We sat together for hours that day, recounting every detail of the past, every subtle manipulation, every lie Catherine had woven so carefully into our lives. I spoke without anger, without accusation, only the clear, undeniable truth of my experience. Matthew listened, his expression shifting from disbelief to horror to shame, as the reality of his mother's betrayal became evident. It was a painful process, both for him and for me, but it was necessary. The truth had to be spoken, fully, and without compromise, if justice was to be achieved. As he absorbed each revelation, I could see the transformation taking place within him. The man who had once doubted my loyalty, who had abandoned me based on whispers and insinuations, was now confronting the depth of his mistake. His hands shook, his eyes glistened with unshed tears, and his voice faltered as he admitted the truth. He had long avoided that Catherine had manipulated him, that he had allowed her influence to overshadow his love and trust, and that he had lost something irreplaceable because of it. Catherine, however, was far from defeated. When she realized that Matthew was questioning her, that he was no longer blindly accepting her narrative, she reacted with the same cunning and ferocity that had allowed her to control us for so long. Her attempts to justify, deny, and deflect were relentless, but Matthew no longer wavered. The woman who had once seemed invincible in her manipulation now faced a son who refused to be guided by lies, and a daughter-in-law who had endured her deceit and survived. The confrontation reached its peak one evening when Matthew decided to address Catherine directly, armed with evidence, reflection, and the clarity he had gained from our conversations. I observed from a distance, knowing that this was a pivotal moment, not just for Matthew and Catherine, but for the validation of the life I had fought to preserve. As the conversation unfolded, Catherine's confidence faltered, her carefully constructed web of lies unraveling under the weight of truth. Every denial, every deflection, every attempt to manipulate was met with calm, unwavering scrutiny. The facade she had maintained for years began to crack, revealing the fear and frustration beneath. I felt a complex mix of emotions as I witnessed this. There was no joy in Catherine's humiliation, no glee in seeing her influence diminish. Only a profound understanding that truth, patience, and resilience have a power far greater than deception. I had lived through the consequences of her manipulation, endured the pain of betrayal, and emerged stronger. Now justice was taking its course, not through vengeance, but through the undeniable clarity of facts, memory, and accountability. Matthew, for his part, was transformed. The process of confronting Catherine, acknowledging his own role in believing her lies, and witnessing the unraveling of her influence was both humbling and enlightening. He recognized the magnitude of the mistakes made, the pain caused, and the years lost. Yet, in this recognition, there was also a commitment to change, to rebuild trust where it had been broken, and to honor the resilience and integrity of the woman he had once doubted. Our conversations continued late into the night, each revelation building upon the last, each acknowledgement of past mistakes bringing us closer to understanding and closure. I shared my feelings, my fears, and the moments of despair that had shaped the months following our separation. Matthew listened without interruption, absorbing the depth of my experience and the consequences of decisions made under false influence. It was a profound moment, not of reconciliation in love, but of reconciliation with truth, accountability, and the acknowledgement of suffering endured. As Catherine's control over him diminished, her influence over the narrative collapsed entirely. Her attempts to justify her actions became increasingly desperate, but the evidence, reflection, and persistence of truth were insurmountable. Every lie, every insinuation, every calculated move was exposed, leaving her unable to manipulate or distort reality. For the first time, she faced the full weight of the consequences of her actions, not through public shaming, but through the undeniable clarity of truth and the awakening of those she had tried to control. Throughout this process, I remained vigilant but composed. I knew that my role was not to fight, not to confront directly, but to endure, observe, and allow the natural course of revelation and accountability to unfold. The strength I had developed over months of isolation, reflection, and resilience proved invaluable. I had survived betrayal, manipulation, and abandonment, and now I was witnessing the consequences of those actions with clarity and perspective. Matthew and I began to navigate a delicate path of understanding. The man who had once doubted me, who had abandoned me under the influence of lies, was now committed to recognizing the truth and honoring the integrity of our past. There was no rush, no expectation of instant reconciliation, only the slow, careful process of rebuilding understanding, acknowledging pain and observing justice take its rightful course. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of Catherine's influence continued to diminish. Each conversation, each reflection, each acknowledgement of her manipulation chipped away at the authority she had once wielded over our lives. Her confidence, once unshakable, was replaced by anxiety and frustration, and it became clear that the control she had exercised so meticulously could no longer withstand scrutiny. For me, this period was transformative. The months of suffering, reflection, and endurance had forged a resilience that allowed me to observe events with clarity, empathy, and strength. I had learned that survival is not merely the act of enduring pain, but the active reclamation of one's life, the assertion of truth, and the quiet, persistent observation of justice as it unfolds. By the end of this part, the dynamics between Matthew, Catherine, and myself had shifted irrevocably. Matthew had begun to fully recognize the manipulation. Catherine's control had started to crumble, and I had reclaimed my narrative, my dignity, and my strength. The air was heavy with the weight of the truths finally coming to light. Months of reflection, quiet endurance, and careful observation had culminated in a moment where nothing could be denied. Matthew had seen the inconsistencies, traced the patterns, and recognized the extent of Catherine's manipulation. Each revelation built upon the last, a chain of clarity that left no room for doubt. For the first time in years, the power she had wielded over our lives was completely exposed. Catherine's reaction was a mixture of disbelief, frustration, and fear. The woman who had seemed untouchable in her manipulation now faced undeniable proof that her carefully constructed lies could not withstand scrutiny. Every word she had whispered, every insinuation she had planted, every moment of control she had exerted came crashing down around her. She attempted to justify her actions, to redirect blame, to twist narratives, but the evidence, combined with Matthew's reflections and my own clear account, left her with nowhere to hide. Matthew confronted her one evening in the quiet of his home, a place that had once been dominated by her authority and influence. He stood tall, calm, and resolute, and I watched as he spoke with a clarity and purpose that had been absent for years. He recounted every observation, every discrepancy, and every reflection he had made since realizing the truth. Catherine's confident tone faltered, her words became defensive, and the veneer of control she had maintained for so long shattered visibly. The strength that had allowed her to dominate our lives for years was gone, replaced by the reality of her exposure. Watching this, I felt a complex swirl of emotions. There was relief for the vindication of truth, There was sadness for the years stolen and the trust broken. There was satisfaction for the acknowledgement of my endurance. And there was quiet hope for the possibility of a future untainted by manipulation. I had survived Catherine's schemes, endured Matthew's blind trust, and remained steadfast in my truth. Now justice was being served not as revenge, but as the natural consequence of deception meeting reality. Matthew, for his part, seemed almost transformed. The guilt, remorse, and regret were evident in his demeanor. Yet there was also a commitment to change, to honor the truth, and to ensure that the past would not dictate the future. He acknowledged the mistakes he had made, the pain he had caused, and the moments of doubt he had allowed to overshadow love and trust. Each acknowledgement was a step toward accountability, a step toward reclaiming integrity, and a step toward understanding the resilience I had shown in the face of betrayal. In the weeks following this confrontation, Catherine's influence continued to diminish. Friends and family began noticing her behavior, the contradictions in her stories, and the unraveling of her carefully curated narrative. She was no longer able to manipulate perceptions or control conversations without immediate scrutiny. The authority she had once wielded with confidence became a source of embarrassment, frustration, and isolation. The woman who had orchestrated my suffering now faced the reality that her actions had consequences far beyond her control. I, meanwhile, continued to rebuild my life. Every day was an act of reclaiming strength and dignity. I nurtured relationships that had been neglected, pursued interests that had been postponed, and embraced the independence that had once seemed impossible under the shadow of manipulation. Each small victory reinforced my resilience and reminded me that survival is not just enduring pain, but actively reclaiming one's narrative, asserting truth, and asserting control over one's life. Matthew began to seek reconciliation, not romantic, not as it had been, but as a recognition of truth, accountability, and the restoration of integrity. We spent hours discussing the past, acknowledging the pain caused, and considering the lessons learned. The man who had doubted me, who had abandoned me under the sway of lies, now approached our interactions with humility, clarity, and a desire to understand. It was not love rekindled, but it was trust and recognition of the reality that had been suppressed for too long. The culmination of these revelations was not dramatic in a public sense, but profoundly transformative in the personal sphere. Catherine could no longer dictate narratives, control perceptions, or wield her influence without scrutiny. Matthew, fully aware of the manipulation and its consequences, began to reclaim his life, relationships, and integrity. And I, Isabella, had emerged from years of betrayal, isolation, and heartbreak with clarity, resilience, and a renewed sense of self-worth. This period of exposure, confrontation, and acknowledgement allowed me to witness the full arc of Catherine's manipulation and its consequences. The woman who had tried to destroy me through lies and deceit now faced the undeniable truth. The son she had misled recognized the error of his blind trust, and the life that had been disrupted began to stabilize. I had survived and in doing so ensured that the consequences of manipulation could no longer be ignored or concealed. There was also a quiet lesson in all of this, that resilience, patience, and adherence to truth hold a power far greater than manipulation or deceit. I had endured months of emotional turmoil, witnessed betrayal at its most personal level, and faced the isolation that comes when trust is broken. Yet the endurance had not been passive. It had been active, deliberate, and conscious. I documented memories, observed patterns, and preserved my narrative, ensuring that when the moment arrived, the truth would be undeniable. Matthew too had changed. The realization of Catherine's deceit had forced him to confront not only her lies, but also his own vulnerabilities, mistakes, and failures. His remorse was tempered by a commitment to integrity and a determination to acknowledge the truth fully. In doing so, he allowed himself to move beyond blind trust and embrace understanding, reflection, and accountability. By the end of this part, the dynamics between us had shifted completely. Catherine's influence had been dismantled, her authority undermined, and the foundation she had relied upon for control thoroughly exposed. Matthew and I stood on solid ground, not as a rekindled couple, but as survivors of deception, witnesses to truth and participants in the restoration of integrity. The path ahead remained challenging, but it was grounded in reality, honesty, and the knowledge that manipulation, no matter how skilled, cannot endure against patience, observation, and the unwavering assertion of truth. The story of these months, the confrontation, the exposure, the unraveling of lies served as both a personal catharsis and a testament to the power of resilience. I had survived what many would have found unbearable. I had endured betrayal and manipulation at the hands of someone who should have protected me. And through endurance, clarity, and patience, I had witnessed the emergence of justice. This was not vengeance, but restoration. A quiet, powerful, and enduring acknowledgement that truth prevails. And yet, even as Catherine faced the consequences of her actions, and Matthew embraced the clarity that had long eluded him, the final stage of this journey remained. The emotional closure, the reconciliation with the past, and the affirmation of survival would come in time. But the lessons were already clear. Strength is forged in adversity, integrity is preserved through truth, and endurance transforms pain into empowerment. As the days settled into a fragile but firm sense of stability, I began to envision a future that was no longer dictated by lies, fear, or manipulation. Each decision, each step, each choice was guided by clarity, resilience, and an understanding of my own worth. The years of betrayal and the shadows cast by Catherine's deceit had not destroyed me. They had refined me, strengthened me, and prepared me for the ultimate resolution that awaited in the final chapter of this journey. The final weeks of this ordeal were unlike anything I had imagined. Months of enduring Catherine's manipulations, living under the shadow of Matthew's misplaced trust, and surviving the betrayal of someone who should have loved and protected me, had brought me to a point where nothing could shake the truth I had fought so hard to preserve. Every conversation, every reflection, every memory led to a single undeniable conclusion. Catherine's control had finally disintegrated, and Matthew had fully grasped the depth of the manipulation that had driven a wedge between us. Matthew's single quotes as transformation was complete. The man who had abandoned me so easily, so blindly trusting in his mother's deception, now faced the reality of his actions with humility and remorse. He spent hours with me recounting moments he had dismissed, reflecting on the subtle ways Catherine had twisted events to her advantage, and acknowledging the consequences of believing her lies. It was a painful process for both of us, but it was essential. Understanding, recognition, and accountability were the pillars upon which the resolution of this chapter rested. Catherine, meanwhile, struggled in ways that were both visible and unavoidable. The woman who had wielded influence and control with such precision was now confronted with a reality she could not distort or manipulate. Every attempt to justify her actions fell flat against the weight of evidence and the clarity of memory. Friends, family, and acquaintances who had once unquestioningly accepted her version of events now noticed the contradictions, the inconsistencies, and the subtle signs of deceit. Her authority, carefully maintained for years, had crumbled under the persistence of truth. I observed all of this with a quiet, almost surreal detachment. There was no gloating in her exposure, no satisfaction in seeing her unravel, only the profound awareness that resilience, patience, and adherence to truth have an inherent power that cannot be denied. I had survived months of betrayal, endured emotional devastation, and faced the isolation imposed by deceit, and now I could witness the consequences of those manipulations with clarity and strength. My life, once controlled and dictated by others, was finally reclaiming its natural course. Matthew and I spent long hours discussing the past, not to dwell on pain, but to fully understand the sequence of events that had led to our separation. He admitted the moments when doubt had replaced trust, when fear had overtaken love, and when he had allowed someone else's narrative to override his own perception. His humility was genuine, and his recognition of my endurance and integrity was unwavering. For the first time in years, I felt that the man who had hurt me so deeply now fully comprehended the reality he had once ignored. Our conversations also turned toward the future. While there was no expectation of rekindled romance, there was a desire to rebuild trust, clarity, and mutual respect. We spoke about boundaries, honesty, and the lessons learned from deception. Matthew's commitment to understanding the consequences of his actions and acknowledging my experience created a foundation for a healthier dynamic moving forward. It was not about reclaiming the past, but about constructing a future based on truth, reflection, and integrity. Catherine's influence had completely diminished by this point. Attempts to manipulate, control, or distort reality were met with immediate recognition and resistance. Her confidence had vanished, replaced by frustration and a desperate clinging to narratives that no longer held power. The careful web of lies she had spun for years was undone by observation, evidence, and persistence. She had no control, no authority, and no ability to reshape the truth, and it was clear to all involved that her era of dominance had ended. For me, the culmination of this journey was both cathartic and transformative. I had endured pain that might have destroyed others, survived betrayal that seemed insurmountable, and emerged with clarity, strength, and an unwavering sense of self. My resilience had been tested, my integrity challenged, and my patience strained. But through it all, I had preserved my identity and my narrative. This final phase, witnessing the collapse of deception and the acknowledgement of truth, affirmed the power of endurance and integrity in ways I had only hoped to experience. Matthew and I also reflected on the emotional toll of this experience. We spoke openly about the grief, anger, and sadness that had accompanied the months of manipulation, and how those emotions had shaped our perceptions. There was acknowledgement of the subtle ways Catherine had undermined trust, inserted doubt, and created conflict. Through this process, we reached a deeper understanding of ourselves and each other, not as a married couple rekindling love, but as survivors who had faced profound deception and emerged stronger for it. The final confrontation with Catherine was quiet, almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. She no longer possessed the authority to argue, persuade, or control. Every word, every denial, every deflection fell flat against the undeniable clarity of truth. Her actions had consequences, not through dramatics or vengeance, but through observation, reflection, and the awareness of those she had sought to manipulate. Justice, in its quiet and inevitable form, had arrived. As this chapter closed, I felt a profound sense of closure. The pain of betrayal remained a part of my story, but it no longer defined me. The endurance, the clarity, and the strength I had cultivated became the markers of my journey. Matthew's recognition of truth and accountability reinforced the understanding that even the most deeply ingrained manipulation cannot withstand the persistence of observation, reflection, and resilience. I also recognized the importance of reclaiming my life fully. I pursued personal passions, strengthened friendships, and engaged in opportunities that had been postponed during the years overshadowed by deception. Each decision, each step, each moment of growth became a testament to survival and empowerment. The years of pain and manipulation were not erased, but they were transformed into lessons, strength, and unwavering clarity. In the end, Catherine's attempts to destroy me failed not because of confrontation or revenge, but because resilience and truth cannot be subverted indefinitely. Matthew's awakening, the exposure of lies, and the assertion of integrity had dismantled her power. I had survived, and through that survival I had ensured that deception could no longer dictate the course of my life. The story of manipulation, betrayal, and endurance reached its natural conclusion, leaving all of us forever changed, yet grounded in truth and reality. I realized, finally, that life is rarely fair, and people may attempt to hurt, manipulate, or destroy you. But resilience, clarity, and truth will always endure. Pain transforms into strength, suffering becomes wisdom, and endurance shapes the foundation of who we truly are. I had survived the storm, witnessed justice quietly unfold, and reclaimed my life. Isabella was no longer a victim but a survivor, empowered by the trial she had faced. To anyone watching this, remember, no matter how deeply someone may try to deceive, manipulate, or harm you, your strength, truth, and perseverance will prevail. Stand firm in your integrity, trust in your resilience, And never let anyone else define your worth. Your story, your truth, and your life belong to you, and no one else has the power to take them away. If my story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe for more real-life experiences of resilience and triumph over betrayal. Your support helps bring these stories to those who need hope, inspiration, and the courage to stand strong.